Imagine a hidden tax woven into the fabric of nearly everything you buy, from your morning coffee to the car you drive and even the clothes in your closet. That's essentially what tariffs are. And under former President Donald Trump's administration, they've become a central, often controversial, pillar of economic policy. While proponents argue tariffs protect domestic industries and a certain national self-interest, the reality, as many economists and global leaders contend, is far more complex and costly.
Today say himself that he is surprised at how this has progressed because as of 12:01 Eastern, there is now this 50% tariff. It doubled a 25% baseline tariff that's been in place since August 7th by slapping an additional 25% tariff on top of that over India's imports of Russian energy supply.
Here's the thing, here's what people miss. It's not just about words. It's about the warrior ethos. It's about what the department is supposed to do.
We're going to dive deep into why these import taxes are generally considered detrimental, not just for the U.S. economy, but for the intricate web of global trade and international relations. What are tariffs? At their core, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. When the U.S. imposes a tariff, it's typically U.S. importers or domestic businesses that pay this tax to the U.S. government, not the foreign country directly, when these costs are often passed on to consumers. The second Trump administration's tariff expansion since January 2025, the average applied U.S. tariff rate has surged from approximately 2.5% to an estimated 18.6% as of August 2025, with some estimates placing it as high as 27% at one point. The highest level in over a century, this expansion involves several types of duties. Reciprocal tariffs, announced on April 2nd, 2025, what Trump called Liberation Day, these tariffs declared a national emergency over the U.S. trade deficit and invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to authorize sweeping duties. A universal 10% baseline tariff took effect on April 5th, with higher country-specific rates ranging from 11% to 50%.
A baseline of a minimum of 10%, and some of them will be much higher, 40%, 50%, 60%, as they've been doing to us over the years.
Intended for nations with significant trade deficits with the U.S. The administration's formula for these reciprocal tariffs was widely criticized by economists as overly simplistic and having little relation to actual trade barriers, often vastly overstating foreign tariffs. For example, a 39% trade deficit with the EU led to a 20% tariff, while actual EU tariffs on U.S. goods averaged 3%. Trafficking tariffs, these specifically targeted countries like Canada, Mexico, and China, justified by claims of their failure to stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. Initially 25% on Mexico and Canada and 10% on China, these rates have seen adjustments and delays. Section 232 tariffs, imposed under the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, these tariffs are based on national security concerns. Examples include the 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum and a 25% tariff on imported automotives and auto parts from most countries. Investigations are also ongoing or completed for copper, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and other sectors. Secondary tariffs, a new policy introduced by the Trump administration, these penalize third-party countries for trading with targeted nations. A notable example is the 25% secondary tariff imposed on India for purchasing Russian oil, bringing its total base tariff to 50%. De minimis exemption closure, executive orders also sought to eliminate the de minimis exemption, which allowed low-value shipments, under $800, to enter the U.S. duty-free. This significantly impacted Chinese e-commerce companies like Shein and AliExpress. Why tariffs are bad for the U.S. economy? The tax on Americans. Why higher prices for consumers? A hidden tax on households. Tariffs directly increase the prices of imported goods. For example, the price of imported washing machines rose due to tariffs. And surprisingly, so did the price of domestically made ones, as increased demand allowed domestic producers to also raise prices. Studies suggest Trump's proposed tariffs could cost the average American household $1,700 or more in higher prices annually. This is because companies typically pass the cost of tariffs on to consumers. Retailers warned Trump that escalating trade wars would lead to visible price increases and product shortages. A Reuters and Ipsos poll found that 73% of Americans expected a price surge under Trump's tariffs, and 57% opposed them. Inflationary pressures fueling the cost of living. These import taxes and subsequent price hikes contribute to overall retail and producer inflation. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, a key inflation measure, has risen from near the Federal Reserve's 2% target to about 3% since April 2025. By June, the PCE index showed prices climbed 2.6% over 12 months, indicating accelerating inflation as tariffs permeate the economy. The Federal Reserve initially planned interest rate cuts in 2025 to stimulate growth, but rising inflation due to tariffs has prevented these cuts, dampening economic expansion and complicating monetary policy. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell expressed concerns about tariff-driven price increases, slowing GDP growth and the risk of stagflation. The U.S. economy's once robust growth is expected to slow significantly. After growth rates near 3% in 2023 and 2024, GDP growth is forecast to slow to 1.9% in 2025 and 1.2% in 2026. Tariffs contribute to the slowdown by raising costs and reducing demand. The risk of stagflation, stagnant growth coupled with high inflation, is increasingly apparent. The Federal Reserve and OECD have downgraded U.S. GDP growth forecasts. Job losses, a cost to American workers. While tariffs might protect some specific domestic industries, they often lead to job losses in others, particularly in downstream industries that rely on imported components. For example, companies that use imported steel for cars face higher input costs, squeezing profit margins and potentially leading to layoffs. Automaker Stellantis announced layoffs for 900 American employees after auto tariffs were imposed. The manufacturing sector lost a net total of 14,000 jobs in May and June combined in 2025, and job openings have decreased by about 100,000 since the start of the Trump administration. Economists forecast that tariffs could push the unemployment rate to recessionary levels, potentially to 4.7% or higher by the end of 2025. One study on washing machine tariffs found that while about 1,800 jobs were created, mostly by foreign companies opening U.S. plants, the price increases cost consumers $1.5 billion, meaning consumers effectively paid $815,000 per job created, a very expensive job creation program. Increased business costs and uncertainty. Businesses face higher costs for raw materials and imported goods, leading to reduced profit margins. The rapidly fluctuating and ambiguous nature of tariff policies creates significant uncertainty, making long-term planning difficult for businesses. Ford Motor Company anticipated a $2 billion hit to earnings from tariffs. Weakening U.S. dollar and reduced purchasing power. Tariffs have coincided with a weakening of the U.S. dollar against major currencies, the euro, yen, and pound, which reduces American consumers' purchasing power and complicates trade balances. This challenges long-held assumptions about U.S. economic supremacy. Impact on tourism. The U.S. tourism industry is forecast to incur considerable losses, potentially up to $29 billion, due to tariffs, travel bans, and other restrictive policies. International visitor spending is expected to decline by $12.5 billion, with an 8.2% reduction in international inbound travel by 2025. Legal challenges and constitutional questions. Federal courts have ruled that some tariffs invoked under the IEEPA are illegal, citing that the national emergency declared by Trump, trade deficits and fentanyl trafficking, bore no rational connection to the trade measures imposed. One D.C. court even held that IEEPA does not authorize tariffs at all. These rulings question whether the president is overstepping authority traditionally reserved for Congress to levy taxes. Despite these rulings, the tariffs remain in effect pending appeals. The Supreme Court is likely to weigh in on these cases. Why tariffs are bad for the world economy. Other countries rarely accept tariffs without retaliation. They typically impose their own duties on U.S. exports, causing U.S. exports to shrink. For example, China responded to U.S. tariffs by imposing its own duties, which escalated to 125% tariffs on American goods at one point, in response to U.S. tariffs that peaked at 145% on Chinese goods. Canada and Mexico also implemented retaliatory tariffs in response to U.S. duties on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. Canada, for instance, implemented 25% tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods. The EU initially planned 26 billion euros in countermeasures against U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, and later considered increasing this to nearly 100 billion euros worth of U.S. goods in response to broader tariffs. Disruption of global supply chains. Tariffs create uncertainty and make it harder for global supply chains to operate efficiently, affecting industries reliant on international components and manufacturing. For instance, the semiconductor industry, with its complex global flow of chips, faces significant uncertainty from high U.S. tariffs. China also temporarily halted exports of critical rare earth minerals, essential for high-tech goods, in retaliation. The closure of the de minimis exemption globally, effective August 29, 2025, led international shipping companies across Europe and Asia to announce they would suspend deliveries to the United States due to regulatory ambiguity, weaponizing tariffs and challenge to national sovereignty. Trump has increasingly used tariffs not just for trade imbalances, but to impose political will on issues unrelated to trade. He pressured Brazil with a 50% tariff, later 40% plus 10% reciprocal, while criticizing the legal prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro and demanding restrictions on U.S. social media companies be lifted. This directly challenged the right of the Brazilian Supreme Court to determine if Bolsonaro attempted a coup. India's 50% tariff rate is seen as an unfair punishment for its purchase of discounted Russian oil. Trump cited Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to recognize a Palestinian state as making it very hard to reach a trade deal, injecting geopolitics into trade negotiations. India faced 25 to 50% tariffs for initially refusing U.S. military flights carrying deported Colombian nationals. This aggressive tariff diplomacy is seen as attempting to trample over national sovereignty and forcing allies into unfriendly deals. Reshaping old alliances, the rise of collective resistance. This aggressive approach is prompting a counter-reaction from the global south, with countries like Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRICS nations, exploring collective resistance. BRICS economies now represent over 55% of the global population and an estimated 37.3% of global GDP based on purchasing power parity. Leaders like Brazil's President Lula da Silva are discussing with counterparts in China, India, and Russia how to unite against unilateralism and protectionism. This is leading some nations, traditionally friendly to the U.S., to diversify their trade and seek new partners, with China potentially being a big winner geopolitically. Lula has also advocated for bypassing the U.S. dollar in trade, a long-standing goal of China, asking, "Why should I be tied to the dollar, a currency I do not control?" Impact on specific countries. India faces significant export challenges due to a 50% tariff on $48.2 billion worth of goods effective August 27, severely impacting labor-intensive sectors like textiles and seafood. India's government is exploring support measures, but has stated it will not retaliate with counter-tariffs. India's Prime Minister Modi, once seen as a close ally, is now dealing with higher U.S. tariffs than even China. Taiwan, faced a 32% reciprocal tariff, but with semiconductor products, its primary export, initially excluded. Taiwan's government called the tariffs unreasonable and offered to increase imports from the U.S. and remove all tariffs on American goods instead of retaliating. Japan. Nikkei 225 stock market fell significantly after facing a 25% tariff on cars and car parts and 24% on other goods. Analysts estimate a 0.8% decrease in Japan's GDP. Japan negotiated a 15% tariff. South Korea imposed a reciprocal tariffs of 25%, prompting emergency support for its auto industry, later negotiated down to 15%. Conclusion. Tariffs, while presented as a strategic tool to boost domestic industries and assert economic power, come with significant and far-reaching costs. From higher prices, inflationary pressures, and job losses at home, to disrupted global trade, retaliatory measures, and shifting geopolitical landscapes abroad, the evidence strongly suggests that everyone, in one way or another, pays the price. The long-term impacts remain to be fully seen, but the global economic and political environment is undeniably changing dramatically, pushing nations to reevaluate alliances and seek new paths.